Hello everyone and welcome to our third module. We're talking about constructivism this week, and constructivism is a theory that is often discussed as one of the major theories of international relations, one of the accepted mainstream theories of international relations today, but it wasn't always so. Constructivism for a long time was considered kind of out there and a bit wacky by a lot of people who were sort of more committed to the scientific way of looking at things. And I think what's interesting about constructivism is that it has become so acceptable today to talk about. Sorry, there's a dog upstairs there, and it's just where I'm at the moment. There's nothing I can do about it right now, sorry, but that might interrupt us from time to time. Anyway, constructivism is becoming more and more acceptable as a theory, and so today I think we'll be trying to understand why that's so, why constructivism has sort of come in from the cold, so to speak. And there's reasons for it. One of the reasons I would argue, just to sort of give you a heads up, is that I think constructivism has sort of managed to be able to pitch itself to scholars as a theory that while it makes these sort of non-scientific maneuvers, it compromises on the worldview in terms of its focus on nation states as the primary actors, much as the same as realism focuses on nation states as the primary actors. So it's just something to watch out for. Whether constructivism takes the momentum of its theory far enough, whether it goes deep enough into the kind of conclusions that it's trying to draw, whether it follows its conclusions through all the way. Perhaps it stops short of the what you would say would be the rational conclusion of its hypothesis, although that's something I'll need to prove to you throughout the course of this lecture. So if you don't understand me fully at the moment, hang on there and I will try to get you there by the end of this class. Now, constructivism's key sort of phrase is, if you will, is anarchy is what states make of it. And that's actually a really pretty useful way of thinking about it. We talked about anarchy as something through neorealism, as anarchy that's something that forces nation states to act. We saw that in classical realism there was some dubiousness about that proposition, that perhaps human psychology had something to do with it, but realism, even classical realism, still held on to anarchy as a key permissive cause of war. And so consequently, there's a sense that even classical realism takes anarchy just a little bit too seriously from a constructivist point of view. Liberals take anarchy very seriously because they believe that while it exists, it can be mitigated by nation states acting rationally. So certainly that's very easy for us to understand. But what's really interesting about liberalism is it still believes some of the basic ideas of realism, right? It still believes in rational nation states, the possibility of rational nation states existing through the realization of republican constitutions, and over time elaborating a kind of a positive sum scenario as we described it last week, wherein through cooperation the shadow of the future is eliminated and nation states fall into the habit of thinking kindly of each other, shall we say. To use Kant's term, nation states become familiar with each other in terms of their consensuality. So we have a lot of things on the table then from realism and from liberalism. Constructivism makes a different turn altogether. It's not to say that it doesn't think anarchy matters. It's not to say that it doesn't think cooperation matters. But it starts from a different premise. It starts from the premise that anarchy, the essential meaning of anarchy, is not given, whereas for all the realists and for the liberals, it kind of is. It's kind of bad. Anarchy is the enemy. Constructivists basically think that anarchy is whatever we say it is, and it has always been so. So they don't, whereas the liberals and the realists all sort of conjecture that once upon a time there was this sort of negative thing called anarchy. Even in the Lockean vision, anarchy is seen as having a deficit of some sort, right? So constructivists are coming along and saying anarchy really doesn't have an essential meaning or purpose, and so if we can keep that in mind, then we'll be fine. Why do wars happen? Just by the way, as a sort of a preview from constructivism, because I sort of want to give you the punchline now as opposed to save it till later. From a constructivist point of view, the basic idea is, as I'm getting this from Michael Barnett, that a world of Mahatma Gandhis will be very different from a world of Osama bin Laden's. That's interesting, right? So what it basically means is that it depends really on the actors. The actors are the ones that make the content of anarchy. Anarchy itself is a kind of a meaningless term. If you have a bunch of people operating in the world and they think that they're all Mahatma Gandhis, like if I think of myself and you think of yourself as Mahatma Gandhi, then effectively that means we see that in each other. What is Mahatma Gandhi, by the way? He's a person who puts forward the idea that peaceful, non-violent means of conflict resolution are superior to violent means of conflict resolution. Then it sort of follows that the world would be peaceful. And of course, Osama bin Laden believes that the sword is mightier than the pen, so a world full of Osama bin Ladens would be a world that would be ultimately very conflict-driven. So what I want to emphasize here is that this is an actor-focused theory, right? And it is a theory that's focused on the culture of the actors, whereas the other theories presuppose that the actors are all kind of rational, that they are sort of inherently utility maximizing, and that the real trick is to overcome, the real trick is to focus on anarchy and whether anarchy can be overcome or not. And even in the classical realist view, anarchy is still very, very powerful as a permissive cause of war. So we'll just move on and take ourselves through this lecture then, shall we? The first move that I really have to introduce you to here is the distinction between positivism and naturalism on the one hand, and this will set us up for, on the other hand, thinking about constructivism and post-positivism on the other. But these are some highfalutin terms, if you will. We'll have to contend with them, but once we've got them understood, I think we'll be very well established and set up for thinking about constructivism. So the reality is most IR theories are positivistic, and I've already sort of hinted at that, haven't I, earlier on in my introduction when I said that constructivism was sort of a non-scientific approach, or at least that's how it was seen. So the realists and the liberals are the people we're talking about here. We say they are positivistic because they basically follow the premise of scientific reasoning. Positivism, as we define it here, is the underlying methodological assumption of realism. It believes two major things, as we see here on the slide. One is that in order to gain truth, we must observe our object of study over time. That is to say, we have to be able to make generalizations about the behavior of our object of study over time. So if it's international relations, what we're going to do is we're going to turn to the long sweep of history and we're going to try to derive from the long sweep of history truths based on generalities, general tendencies, general trends that appear obvious within the long sweep of history. And that's what enables us to come to our conclusion. And also, to analyze evidence is our second principle. We must use the strict scientific method. And so what that means is that we would be willing to sort of put our personal prejudices outside and leave them at the door, so to speak, as we've been saying before, and try to look at the world as it is and not as we would wish it to be. So I'm interested in that as a kind of a set of conclusions or a set of premises that we can use to describe positivism. It links back to something we were talking about at the start of the quarter, where we wondered whether that kind of approach would be possible from a political science point of view, because if you remember our discussion about Max Weber's quote that the teacher or the professor, the student of political science should leave his or her biases at the door, the minute you take up your personal agenda, you've ceased to teach political science and you've become an active agent in politics. And nobody really wants to do that in the classroom because it's seen as prejudicial. But we did stop for a minute to think about the fact that there's unconscious ideologies. And this is what leads us to my second point here in this slide, which is that while nobody doubts that positivism is useful for studying the real world, the world of rocks, flowers, and gravity, it's not altogether clear that these kind of techniques transfer very well over to the human world, right? And so we need to make a second move here, which is to say that there's positivists in the world of science, but there's also positivists in the world of international relations and social science. And the people who believe that positivism is applicable in social science, we call them naturalists. And so here's our definition of naturalism. Naturalism is the belief that social affairs are just as amenable to the same methods of study as the natural world, right? Now, what's the stake here, right? It's not maybe obvious just yet. The problem really is that positivists who study, or naturalists as we're calling them, who say that human beings can study objective truth about the world of human affairs, they believe that naturalism, that positivism can capture generalized truths about human affairs, human relationships over time. Now, what constructivists are going to respond and say to this is that we get a big problem here when we're trying to speak about the truth of social relationships. There's a blurry line, they argue, between knowledge and action. Human behavior, they're suggesting, isn't just something that's like a rock or flowers or gravity. Instead of being like those natural world objects, human behavior is situated, always situated, in a certain set of assumptions or a certain type of knowledge. As such, the ideas we develop about how man is, socially, tend to affect how we behave towards each other, thereby producing further behavior which confirms our starting assumption. So what I'm trying to suggest here is the idea of a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, that a certain thought about how man is already inculcated in the mind of the scholar, or the mind of the analyst, and then this mindset, if you will, it constitutes a tendency on the part of the scholar to select certain things from the world that confirm the hypothesis and disregard other things, right? It's kind of like a selection bias, right? If you want to see everyone in the world a certain way, you're just going to look for the things that confirm that view. And so consequently, the knowledge that you'll produce will be knowledge that confirms your bias. And we can formalize that through a discussion of the theories of Karl Popper, who I want to use, and I get this actually oddly from a political economist by the name of George Soros, who's actually a well-known financial investor, and he wrote a book about the financial crisis recently where he cited Karl Popper as a big influence on his ideas. So I had a look at that book, and I thought there would be some useful things here that Karl Popper was talking about that could be applied to our discussion here. And there's one term that really jumped out of the page for me, and that is the term interference reflexivity. But before I tell you a little bit about that, I just want to say that Karl Popper, he was a philosopher who was fascinated by what we've been calling the self-fulfilling prophecy nature of human life, of social life. The thing for Popper was that what he felt was that knowledge that we might have of the world is only ever partial, right? It's only ever incomplete. We never have the full story. And that is because of what we've been saying, that human beings can only know on the basis of how humans are acting at any given time, the general nature of human existence, the general nature of social life. So how they are acting at that time in a given period of social life depends on what they already know, ironically. So therefore, they may, for example, act in risk-adverse ways if they think, for example, that human nature is fundamentally selfish, or they might act in risk-prone ways if they think that human nature is okay. And it's the tendency of people, based on what they already think they know, the story they've already been told, in other words, about human behavior, that creates their own tendency to act a certain way. So what we have then is the idea here of reflexivity and interference. Really, what we're trying to talk about here is the idea of a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, in a very literal sense, I think. The idea of reflexivity here implying the idea of a loop, of something falling back on itself. Interference, of course, meaning that it's not just falling back in a loop, but it's falling back on a loop in a sense that changes or acts on the action that's already ongoing. So if you're part of the object you're studying, and you are part of a movement within that body, that creates a frame of knowledge that confirms certain tendencies within that object of knowledge, then that constitutes a kind of a story. That story acts back on the object, which is the population, of course, that's reading the knowledge and following the knowledge, confirming what they already think they know about themselves, and causing them to continue on in a way that that they believe is commensurate to the kinds of interactions that are most appropriate for that story. Even if you want to take a self-interested stance on that, if people believe that the people around them are a certain type of people, then it stands to reason that it's in their interests to continue to act in a way that maximizes their security and their chance to profit, to gain within that context. So you can even allow for some rational choice within this, but the key thing here is that what's driving the story, what's driving the outcome, is the fact that the people have perceptions about who they think they are. So, so importantly then, for Karl Popper, what this means is that unlike for the liberals and unlike for the realists, for the people, or whether it's the nation state or its individual actors, they're not rational in the sense that we've been describing in the other two modules, but rather they are reflexive knowers, right? They are engaged in the world through storytelling and through story knowing. And so you might say, well, that's fine, but let's go back to George Soros for a minute, who I was talking about as having written this book that involved the scholarship of Karl Popper, the philosophy of Karl Popper. What Soros derives from all of this is that our knowledge of ourselves may not be perfect, and this is the problem. The story that we are telling might not be the full story. It's just a story after all. What story is ever fully true? What story ever fully exhausts the knowledge that might be out there? And so because our knowledge of ourselves may not be perfect, we might be acting inappropriately. We might be acting in a way that is suboptimal, or could even lead to a negative outcome. So for Soros, of course, the argument is that if you look at the financial crisis that happened recently, and I think this is interesting, the mortgage crisis. Why did the mortgage crisis happen? It happened because everybody thought that housing prices were going to go up and up and up and up, and that was the reality that people thought they were living in. That was the story they were telling themselves about their world, that housing prices were going to go up and up and up. And were housing prices going to, in fact, go up and up and up? No. The answer is, in fact, that that's not true. Housing prices were, historically speaking, have never gone up into infinity. They always come down at a certain point in time. But what was going on, of course, in terms of the financial crisis, was that people's actions were based on what they thought was going on. And so that is a problem for us to reflect on and to consider. If you or I, being maybe of modest income, thought that we were living in a world where housing prices were going to go up and up and up, then even though maybe we couldn't afford a mortgage in the long term, what we might do is we might go to the bank and ask for a mortgage for now, especially the bank being so full of cash and being very eager to give what we call low doc, no doc loans, that is to say, loans without background checks on people's creditworthiness. The banks were taking these very, very risky decisions, which a lot of people complain out and say that that's actually the source of the crisis, that the banks were being so irresponsible, and in fact they were being predatory, but that's another story. The reality is, however, that a lot of people thought that, and were afraid that if they didn't get on what they called a property ladder, that they would stand to lose out, because even if I can't afford a house now, and I can't afford the mortgage for a house now, that asset is going to be valuable next year and more valuable the year after, and the value of the asset will soon outstrip the value of the mortgage. And if that's the case, then I would be a fool not to take advantage of that, because I could engage in flipping the house. I could maybe even make a tidy sum for myself, or at the very least I would eat up my interest rate, and I would end up sitting pretty at the end of the day. with a nice house. And of course, so a lot of people got suckered into that because they thought that was the story. And of course, the television, a lot of the economic advice websites and everything were telling people that this was the world they were living in. And so it's only sort of natural that they would have made actions or made decisions corresponding to what they thought about the world that they were living in. Of course, it was wrong. And they came a cropper, and the whole country came a cropper. But you can see here that from a certain perspective, that this is distinct, say, from a Marxist perspective, which would look at the actions exclusively of the elites and the bankers, which, in fairness, is something to that, all right. But here we would look at the storytelling, the mass society-wide storytelling that took place, where literally everyone was making the same mistake. And it's not to do with people living beyond their means or anything like that. People actually thought that they were doing something rational. And they were doing something rational, but it was only rational within the context of the kind of storytelling that was going on. And this is exactly an example of what we mean then when we say what constructivists are talking about when they say ideas shape reality. Ideas shape reality, then, is the theme of this slide, which is, of course, drawn from the movie The Matrix. And if you haven't seen The Matrix, I encourage you to watch it, because it tells, in a way, it's a great movie if you guys wanted to do it for a midterm, for example, as a study for your for the midterm exam. That would be pretty interesting. I'll definitely have it up there as a choice for you when it comes to midterm time. And the reason being is that I think it's just such a perfect film for thinking about exactly what we're talking about here, how ideas can shape reality. Neo, of course, if you haven't seen the film, Neo is the hero of the film, and he wakes up one day to realize that he's been living in a simulated reality, that everything that he knows, everything that he thinks is going on in his world is in fact not true, that the reality that he's living in is a complete simulation, and that the people he's been interacting with and himself have in reality been stuck in a giant kind of incubator which is being run by a computer system, and the computer system is drawing from their brains and bodies energy to run itself, to run this giant computational machine, and that they've been harvested. But they had no idea they were being harvested. All they thought was that they were human beings interacting in a regular world, just like yours and mine. But Neo soon realizes that because of his particular mastery of, his brain's unique ability to sort of see through the fiction of it, that he has special talents, and that there are people who are trying to resist this power of the computer within the artificial reality to try to reach out to more souls and wake them up so that they too can be resuscitated and brought back to the real world. And Neo is incredulous when he finds out, and he's having trouble accepting all this, because he's like, this is my reality, this is my world, you can't tell me that it's not real. And of course Morpheus, the man who first makes contact with him, says, no, Neo, I'm trying to tell you, when Neo says, what do you mean I can dodge bullets? And Morpheus says, no, Neo, actually, I'm trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to, right? It's not so much about dodging bullets, it's about understanding that the bullets are not real. And of course, for us in our world, not in the world of the Matrix, this is a kind of a puzzling proposition, because you and I know that we can't dodge bullets. And that's actually not the argument we're trying to make at all. Bullets are very, very real, and they are not socially constructed. They will kill you. But in human society, the equivalent of bullets, if we can speak of one, the threats to go to war, the insinuations that for example, we just had a nuclear test in North Korea, that the bullet there, of course, would kill us. The nuclear bomb would kill us, but we also have to contend with the fact that Britain, for example, and France also have nuclear weapons, and they even have nuclear weapons that can go on top of rockets, and they have the rockets to fire them, and they have the submarines to put them on, and they could park their submarines off New York and destroy the entire east coast of the United States if they wanted to. But we don't worry about British or French atomic weapons the way we worry about North Korea maybe someday having a nuclear weapon that would actually be able to reach us. And I personally believe that's a very long, long way away. But I mean, there's something instructive in that, that these different, that they are both bullets, if you will, but they are bullets that we think about differently. The North Korean bullets seem to be much more threatening to us than the British bullets, and that's the question, like, what's going on there? How are ideas shaping our reality and our perception of those weapons? But what's interesting for Neo, to go back to the Matrix, is that, he wakes up, he eventually learns about his reality, and he learns that he's able to overcome it, and he learns that once he's able to do this, he's able to reach out to others and break the loop that we've been talking about, break the loop of interference reflexivity. Now, when it comes to international relations, one classic example of how this applies to us is the question of human nature. Positivists, as we've been arguing about, and the naturalists, of course, who believe that positivistic methods are applicable to human affairs, they argue that human nature exists externally to our preconceived notions about it, i.e. there is a thing called human nature. That's why we have the little caveman up there in the cartoon of the caveman up in the corner. And so they believe that human nature, the deep sort of nature of human beings, underneath all the layers of civilization, there's just an animal, and that animal can be studied and its nature ascertained just as much as we could study a rock or some flowers or gravity and ascertain the nature of those things over time. So if that's true, then what we can say is that it's possible scientifically to come up with an explanation of human nature, or human behavior rather, in terms of human nature. And so for positivists, in terms of how they've turned up in realism and liberalism, they make these generalizations and try to come up with explanations of social conflict, and we've looked at that in terms of positive-sum games, zero-sum games, and those are basically theories that are to do with the nature of anarchy, and whether human nature in anarchy is capable of mitigating the impact of anarchy on our social life. And if we are, then we get liberalism, and if we aren't, then we stay realist. But constructivists disagree with this. They argue that our ideas about human nature are always mediated by culture and by myth. And so in the box here we see a couple of statements about constructivism. First of all, the social world is very different to the natural world. The social world is not made of rocks and flowers. It's made of human beings who are storytelling creatures fundamentally, meaning that you and I are born as a human being into the nature of a storyteller, if you will. We are part of a society populated by storytellers. And so because of that, the reality of human beings, that, i.e. the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, is always internal to the stories that we tell. So we're kind of always stuck in this sort of narrative of ourselves. And what this means is that debating relative versus absolute gains becomes somewhat irrelevant. It's not really about trying to figure out if human beings can accommodate themselves in anarchy to a positive or a zero-sum game. It's more important to see how the rules and the norms of human behavior constitute actors and incite behaviors, right? So really we become now much more focused on stories, myths, cultures. And that's our major point here. That's why through this example of human nature, we can see something very important about why constructivism is different to the other theories that we've been looking at. So how does constructivism play out in international relations theory? Well, there's a couple of propositions I can put forward here for you. Realists, as we know, see anarchy as a structure. Liberals also think that anarchy is a structure, but they believe that states can learn to mitigate this reality. They can mitigate the effects of that structure on human behavior. But constructivists reject the idea that anarchy is a structure. They think that anarchy is to do with how states identify with themselves and others. And the big idea here is identity, right? The idea that identities affect the way states perceive what's going on in anarchy, right? And consequently perceive anarchy itself, right? What they think that anarchy is the problem. They think that anarchy is conflictual and that anarchy is the thing that has to be overcome. And we were just talking a little bit a minute ago about the example of North Korean nuclear weapons, but I think the example of Iranian nuclear weapons might be even more interesting for us, because although it's North Korea that's doing the testing at the moment, I don't think there's any doubt that US policymakers, that US politicians have been very, very engaged in trying to generate fear in the mindset of many Americans about what's going on in Iran at the moment. They are terrified, and they are constantly telling us that we ought to be terrified about an Iranian nuclear weapon. But it's not so clear about why an Iranian nuclear weapon would be more threatening than, say, British nuclear weapons. Something has to be going on there that is shaping our mindset vis-a-vis Iran. That's not at all shaping our mindset vis-a-vis Britain. A realist, for example, would say that all states are the same. They're all billiard balls, right? Remember we talked about that for constructivism, sorry, for realism and neorealism. And in which case then every state is subject to the laws. They're almost scientifically verifiable laws that any state can be balanced out over time, that all you need to do is arrange a balance of power and then you have peace. But for some reason, American policymakers at the moment don't seem to think that that's true vis-a-vis Iran. They think Iran is an irrational state, a special kind of billiard ball that's going off the deep end, so to speak, and that it's not to be trusted. But in that case, that's strange, because most of the time, American policymakers have relied on realism. They have used the logic of realism to justify their foreign policy decisions. Famous realists have been American foreign policy planners, like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. So why would Americans not be sticking to their realist principles when it comes to Iran? It's very strange. Something about Iran changes the mindset and changes the theoretical presuppositions of American foreign policy planners, and it's to do, I think, with this idea that Iran is a non-trustworthy actor, that it's an Osama bin Laden as opposed to a Mahatma Gandhi, so to speak. Although that's a crude metaphor there. But another way of saying this is that the US and the UK do not see anarchy as a threat to their relationship, because their relationship is one of friendship, right? So this is very interesting for us. A realist wouldn't be able to study this, a liberal wouldn't be able to study this, but a constructivist can study this, can try to see how a culture of friendship has grown between the United States and the UK. Whereas a culture of enmity has grown between Iran and Britain, Iran and the US. What are our conclusions here? That if anarchy is not a structure, as we've been saying in the blue box, then perhaps it is, as we're concluding here on this slide, a process. And there's a lot at stake in that differentiation, because a structure is something you can't really do much about. But if anarchy is something that we are making, effectively anarchy is always there, but it's a meaningless term until it has content, until we inject meaning into it through our actions. And if our actions, whether it's our storytelling actions or our foreign policy decision-making actions, are important here, it's that they inject meaning into anarchy, revealing it to be what it is, not a structure, but a process, a structuration process, if you want to be more precise, based on our actions, based on what we do. And that's why Alexander Wendt, who is the subject of our reading this week, says that anarchy is what states make of it, and that's his punchline. So that's the end of part 1 of this lecture. I will be back in a little while with part 2. I hope you enjoyed it.